Today, I want to share a little bit of a personal story, a story of disclosure, betrayal, heartbreak, and some familiar feelings that have surfaced over the last several years. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. I will be sharing my personal experience about some things. And I'm sharing it because I know that there are a lot of you that will be able to relate to some of the things that I talk about today, maybe even quite a bit of it. And I think it's important that we recognize that there are reasons that we might feel things that we feel, that we might struggle in some ways. And it's not about being right or wrong or anything, but it's about recognizing that there are things that we can experience in our lives as adults that can bring up a lot from our past. Because the feelings that we experience in the present moment can feel incredibly familiar and similar to things that we've experienced in the past, even if they might be on the surface pretty different. So, some of you are going to be aware of a couple of these things that I'm going to share at the beginning. So just kind of bear with me a little bit. When I was about 8 years old, I had an experience, and so a little bit of a trigger warning here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail or anything, but I had a very different type of experience in the abuse that I was experiencing. And because of the difference in it, because of part of what happened, it scared me. And immediately afterward, I went to my mom and I told her that I named him, my stepfather tried to kill me. And I had to wake her up to tell her, and she told me that it was a bad dream and to go back to sleep. And as I turned to go back to my room, I remember berating myself for the way in which I told her that it was like too dramatic and that I did it in a wrong way. And because I did it in a wrong way, she didn't believe me. That of course she wouldn't believe me because I was being ridiculous and different kinds of things. Trying to cope with the hurt, with the rejection, with the abandonment that I felt in that moment, none of which I was aware I was feeling. Then, years later, because I never talked about it, it never came up, I never wanted to tell her. Again, because I didn't want to risk that. Then at around 22 years old, was about 22 years old, I don't remember exactly, but I know that it was not too long before she died. We were on the phone having a conversation. I don't really remember how it came about, but she was talking about what a great man my stepfather was, how great he was to me. And she kept kind of talking about that specifically, like mentioning just different ways that he was really great to me and to us, but specifically to me. And I remember sitting there listening to her and kind of feeling a little bit of something, but not really intensely. But I wasn't really responding to her as she was talking about it. And I don't remember how long it went on. It could have been, 30 seconds. It could have been 3 minutes. I'm really not sure. And eventually, I think because I wasn't acknowledging anything that she was saying, she said, well, he was, wasn't he? And I said, no. And I don't remember if that was all I said. I don't remember if I said not really. So I don't remember exactly what it was that I said. But I basically said no, that he wasn't. And I don't remember if she just asked me why. And I told her I don't really remember those circumstances specifically. But somehow I ended up telling her that, or affirming, I'm not sure, that he had abused me, and I believe specifically sexually abused me. And her response in learning that her husband had abused me was to ask me to say, he didn't rape you, did he? He didn't rape you, did he? Is how she said it. And in that moment, I was kind of caught off guard. I wasn't quite sure like what to say. And in my mind at that time, that was before I started healing, like many people, when we think of rape, we have a certain idea of what that looks like, what it feels like. And so in my mind at that time, my experience did not fit that. And part of that is about minimizing. But my understanding of that did not fit with what I viewed as being rape. And so I said no. And her response was, well, or something along the lines of, well, did your father ever abuse you? And that really kind of caught me off guard. And I was like, no. And she said, well, your cousins had said something or whatever. I can't imagine that she would lie about that. But I never heard anything about it. I never heard anything again after that. So I have no idea. But the impact on me was, he didn't rape you, did he? And then immediately asking if my father did. And then when I say no, telling me that other people said that he did to them. And that was it. That was the end of it. I don't know how it ended necessarily. It didn't come up again. And then she died not too long after that. And that was my experience of disclosure in my family at that point, which obviously wasn't ideal, and had a much bigger impact than I realized. And like many of you, whether you've told, whether somebody should have known, whether there were signs or not, obvious or not, I think many people can relate to having experiences minimized, even if they're not your own personal experiences. How many times have we heard people that were around in terms of proximity, people that we know, certainly on news or on movies, that sort of thing? We've all heard comments and suggestions that it's not a big deal, that we should move on, that maybe we're misremembering it, that we're making a big deal out of it, that the person was in a really bad place, or all kinds of things. And it had an impact on me, but I didn't really realize the significance of the impact that it had until later, until after I was on my healing journey. And as I was on my journey, as I then became a therapist, I started hearing a lot of stories that had a lot of similarities to mine, and certainly a lot of differences as well, but ultimately kind of landing in the same place of having an experience in which we share something with somebody, and it could be how we feel about something, not just about abuse. And it's dismissed, it's rationalized, it's minimized. Maybe even you're blamed for it. Maybe you're blamed for being weak and the fact that it bothers you, that it's taking you so long to heal, whatever it might be. But the people around us can often respond in ways that are really minimizing and dismissive of our experiences. And that can show up in so many different ways. And it does come up a lot with moms. Now, I want to be clear, it comes up in all different kinds of relationships, probably in every kind of relationship. But the people who are closest to us in terms of our caregivers. So for some people, that may not be a mom. It could be a dad. It could be an aunt or generally not an uncle, but it could be another family member, a grandparent, or just somebody else that you were very close to. But they will often make excuses and rationalize behavior. And one of the things that comes up a lot in a family system where abuse happens is that a non-offending parent will rationalize and make excuses. Things like, well, they were in a really bad place. They were going through a lot at the time. Or, well, they had a really bad drinking problem at the time. Or they didn't really mean it. They got confused about whose bed they were in. And I don't even know how many times I have heard that. Not for me personally, but from other people. All different kinds of things. And ultimately, that is done to excuse and rationalize the perpetrator's behavior. And sometimes it's verbalized, sometimes it's not, but it will be rationalized or excused because, well, he's such a good person, or he's such a great provider, or he does so much for our community, or he's such a revered person within the church, and he loves everybody, and he would never do something intentional to hurt somebody. Maybe you misunderstood what he was saying or doing. So with everything that I just shared, I'm guessing for most of you, there's some aspect of that you can relate to. And this and what else I'm going to share is why I wanted to share this with you. I've talked about some of those things before, and I think it's just important to reiterate that that is a form of how people cope, right? We've coped with it ourselves by minimizing, denying, avoiding, rationalizing. And other people who learn of this sort of thing cope in similar sorts of ways. Obviously, what they're denying and minimizing is the same thing, but their experience of that is going to be a little bit different. Still not healthy, and certainly not okay, because they're also then denying and minimizing your own experience, your lived experience. But that is a reality. And the idea of minimizing or denying somebody's experience, harmful, traumatic experience, because, well, and I want to be clear, it could be a she, without doubt. But oftentimes, and certainly from my experience and the stories that people have shared with me, it is more often a he. Well, he is this and he's that, and all these things that are supposedly good about him. And while as a therapist, I understand that. I really do. I can understand how that happens, why it happens, and I can understand that from a place without judgment. However, as a human, it can be really difficult to wrap our heads around that, right? Like, how can you hear somebody tell you or know that somebody has hurt, especially a child, particularly a child that you love, that you're supposed to protect? How can you excuse that behavior? How can you make it seem like it's not a big deal? And I'm not going to get into how and why that happens, because that's not the purpose of this video today. But regardless of how or why it's happening, the impact of that is profound on the person hearing it. Because we're already denying and minimizing. And then when we hear somebody else know what our experience is and minimize it, excuse it, whatever it is, not only does that feel hurtful in the moment, even if we're not necessarily consciously feeling that hurt or aware that we're feeling it, but in some ways, even more significantly, it's reinforcing our own denial, minimization, responsibility, and all of that. So that is the reality of what it means to be a survivor. And I've shared a little bit about my early experience with that. So fast forward many years to about 9 years ago. And I'm sharing this part because I know that there are some of you, and I know this because of conversations I've had and messages I've received, and which would likely mean that there are many more of you that I haven't heard from. So about 9 years ago, we were in a situation in this country and even globally. There were circumstances in which there were some really significant things that we were faced with, decisions that we needed to make. And one of those things for me that I was very concerned about was the Supreme Court. And for a couple of reasons. And one of those things I relatively recently shared about the importance of the Violence Against Women Act and healthcare, the healthcare law in this country now. Both of those things meant a lot to me back about 9 years ago as well, and that was a concern to me. And knowing ultimately that the Supreme Court would play a role in that. Additionally, and this has been the case for many years, long before 9 years ago, another thing that has kind of always been in peril, that had, under certain circumstances, could be problematic, is that Roe versus Wade is kind of always something that could be taken away. And so 9 years ago, that was a really significant thing that was on my mind. It was something that was stressing me out. It concerned me. All those pieces did. And again, I'm not necessarily a really political person, but when it comes to our rights, when it comes to having access to things that are really important, not just as we are individuals, but as a group of people, and when it comes to Roe versus Wade, when it comes to healthcare, and even potentially pre-existing conditions, the Supreme Court was very significant. And I was talking in my private conversations, in my private social media, I was sharing a lot about, or quite a bit for me anyway, because I don't share on social media privately really, but I was talking consistently about the election being about the Supreme Court, that other policies were not as important at this particular time as upholding Roe versus Wade. And we were at a time where it was likely that there would be some new Supreme Court nominations. And I kept talking about that. And then as time went on, as everybody else, we were witnessing such abhorrent behavior. We were hearing it with our own ears. We were seeing it with our own eyes. We were hearing recordings of a grown man talking about walking in and seeing half-dressed teenagers, about a man bragging about being able to get away with sexual assault and harassment. We were all hearing it. Everybody was hearing it. And some people were outraged. But the amount of people who rationalized, excused, denied what we were collectively witnessing and hearing was astonishing to me. And it hurt. It hurt because it felt so familiar. And not just for me and my personal experience, but for all the stories, the people who shared their stories with me. There was so much familiarity in that feeling of being dismissed, being called names, being told that you're too sensitive, that you're taking things out of context. He didn't really mean it. All things that we have heard over and over again when we have spoken the reality of our experiences and the impact that it has. So 9 years ago, I was having a really hard time. I was fired up. I was feeling into that space of being an advocate and feeling the empowerment of the importance of fighting for what is right and just. And then November came. Well, let me back up. During that time, I learned that people that I loved and valued, people that took a place in my life that had been vacant because my parents were gone, that there were people that I valued deeply and loved. Who were some of those people who were rationalizing and denying and blaming the other person for this other person's behavior and for their going along with it. And it was hard not to take that personally. I knew that it wasn't. I knew that it really had nothing to do with me at all. Yet it felt really personal because they knew my history. They knew my work. They had talked about being proud of my work. And yet, it wasn't enough for them to consider my opinion, my perspective, both personal and professional. And that broke my heart. But I was very aware this time of the breaking of my heart, unlike when my mom broke it. This time, I was aware that they were choosing a perpetrator, a bully, a liar. And it was really hard not to take it personally. And then November happened, and I was so brokenhearted. I would say I was actually devastated. And again, this isn't about policy specifically. This is not at all about politics. It's about people not being believed. It was about people not taking things seriously, about really important things that affect so many people not mattering to as many people as it didn't seem to matter to, including people that had had similar experiences, people that were going to be deeply negatively affected. And that hurt my heart too. To know that there were so many people who were in such denial and in such a place of trying to self-protect that they were willing to have a perpetrator in the house. And I didn't take that personally at all, but it still broke my heart. Because what does that mean for them? What does it mean for their families? And for 4 years, I was on guard. I was watching the news constantly. I was listening to things that he was saying. I And I did it not because I wanted to, but it was part of my need to feel like I had to know what was going on. I had to be prepared for what was going to happen. And there is no doubt that that is related to the ways that I coped from childhood trauma. And I just recently talked about that in terms of the need to try to feel like we have some control over something. And over the last, unfortunately, this cycle has started a long time ago. It's returned. And yet again, we are faced with being in an environment. And I want to be clear, this is not just in the US. Anybody watching this internationally, you know that it's not in the US only. But there are a lot of you in the US who may not recognize just how widespread this is. And not just because of the things that it might be creating in their own countries, but they're witnessing what is happening. And so they're feeling many of the same things that we are feeling. And even if we are not actively involved, even if we're not even consciously aware, we are in an environment currently in our lives where our neighbors, our friends, our families, our community leaders, our national leaders that are representing us, so many of them are saying who this man is doesn't matter nearly as much as what he can do for me. And that is very familiar to so many people. Willing to put aside that he is a perpetrator. And not just once. Yes, he's only been found liable once. But we know as survivors, how many of us realistically can say that our perpetrators have been found liable, civilly or criminally? Honestly, I don't know that I know anybody. Well, proven or adjudicated, where there has been like a lawsuit. I suppose I do know maybe of a couple of instances in which it came forward in some aspect and they were believed to a degree. But somebody who lies continuously, who degrades people, who bullies people, who makes fun of people, who degrades people based on how they look, what gender they are. Somebody who was found guilty on 34 counts, who is a convicted felon because he lied and he tried to cover up what he did so that he could win an election. Not just somebody who slept with somebody else, who slept with a porn star and tried to cover that up. He tried to cover it up so that he could be in a position to benefit himself, to not have consequences to his behavior. And that is very familiar to so many people. And to have so many people, not just the perpetrator himself, but to have so many people in our lives and around us who will make excuses, deny, minimize, that is hurtful. People who support that, it's hard when we love them, to not take that personally. And I want to be clear. I think that there are a lot of people, and if you are one of them and watching this, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to listen to my experience and my feelings about this, because I'm sure it's not easy. But the reality is that it does feel hurtful when people that you love and care about are so invalidating about that hurt. And it may not be intentional. Just like I know, I very much believe that my mom did not intentionally set out to hurt me, to cause me to create so much self-doubt and mistrust within myself for so long in my life. I have no belief whatsoever that she intentionally did that. I also believe that she would be heartbroken to know that her actions had such a negative impact on me. I do believe that. Doesn't change the fact that it did. And the same is true in this circumstance. And one of the things that I know is really challenging for some people is that how does somebody who has been bullied, how does somebody who has been assaulted, how does somebody who has, like for example, people of color, when he has the beliefs that he does, like how can somebody in that position support somebody like that? It is so incredibly difficult to wrap your head around, and I don't have an answer. Like I can go into it psychologically and come up with all kinds of scenarios and what might be going on with somebody, but it can be really difficult to wrap your head around that. And what do you do with that? Like how do you make sense out of that? And the reality is that it is part of coping, because there isn't a rational way to support somebody in any capacity. There is no rational, cognitive, reasonable way that people will support somebody that will actually harm them, right? That goes against our survival. But because our coping can override everything, particularly unhealthy coping that we've learned long ago can override everything, that's what tends to happen. And I want to be clear, again, that does not mean that the hurt that we might feel is less. And I know for me, it still hurts. Even though I don't take it personally, it still hurts my heart that people that I love and care about seem to not care enough about things that really matter to me to be willing to consider what I have to say. And not just what I have to say, but what so many others have to say as well. So if you can relate to this, if you are feeling some of that too, you're not alone. You're not alone. And whether it is somebody in your family, somebody in your community, somebody within your church, whatever church that might be, we're not alone. And just because other people are not able to acknowledge the truth, are not able to take action based on that truth, it does not mean that you're wrong. It does not mean that you're too sensitive. It does not mean that you're overreacting. at all. And I hope that this helps you connect to that truth, even just maybe a little bit for now. And whatever happens, you're not alone. And while I can't do anything to take that hurt away from you, if you're able to think of it in a way that allows you to not take it personally, while you might still feel the hurt, it doesn't feel quite as deep as it does when you take it personally. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me share what has been present for me for quite a while now, and will continue to be present over these next several months probably, and maybe even longer. And I would love to hear from you, whether you can relate or not, whether you agree with me or not. Again, just to be respectful. That's all I ask. And I want to be clear that I can understand it from a psychological perspective. And this is not meant to judge anybody. I really, truly am sharing my personal experience and how it can relate to others that have shared with me, and even maybe some of you who haven't. Thanks for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.